Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name's Chelsea. I'm co-CEO of Cerebral Fix, chair of the NZGDA for a while, and I'm excited to share with you all today our panel on how to fund your game. We're going to talk about a lot of different areas, and our panelists sort of represent, three different funding streams that you can explore, that games can explore, and we're going to talk about some of the differences between each. We have some questions sort of already laid out, but if you have any questions, we'll save them to the end and we'll do a Q&A. I'd like to start by having each of the panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the area that you represent, and we'll start with Chris.
Oh, good morning, everyone. I think we call this the Sparrow's Fart Hour. Thank you all for not going to Richard Taylor's session across the hall. So I'm from Alt Ventures. We're a small but perfectly formed venture fund focused on investing in New Zealand studios and, I guess, creative technology companies. So we formed about 3 years or so ago. The first game fund we'd been doing pre-seed technology investment prior to that. The fund's invested in 13 sort of studios and game companies. I think we've put out about 6 games into market in the last sort of 18 months. They range from the likes of Deep Hill Games with Abiotic Factor, Usual Suspects with It's Only Money. We've got some games coming out next year as well. So we've sort of run the gamut. We work a little bit with code. Obviously, we've got some publishers involved in some of the games as well. It's been a journey. Hand over to these guys.
Hey, I'm John Cartwright. So I've been making games for the past 35, 36 years. Which is why I look so youthful. I now run a game consulting, so I work with developers and publishers really to commercialize games. So a lot of what I do is help developers find publishers, and then on the publishing side, I'm looking for games for publishers, scouting for them. So I've done a lot of work with Team 17, and so that's brought me a lot to New Zealand to work with Black Salt Games, Bouncing Monkey Games, and yeah, it's a panel of middle-aged white men, incredible.
Sorry, yes. I'm past middle-aged and white, and also in the industry for 35 years. We'll be taking donations at the end. I'll be sitting out on the street. I'm Tim. I'm from Code. We're based in Dunedin, but now operating nationally as a body that supports the growth of a sustainable game development ecosystem in Aotearoa. That means doing a lot of work around grant funding for smaller studios, and also a lot of capability and pathways work. Before that, I used to do a lot of marketing and communications work with my own agency, and also working for Activision. And I was a journalist when it actually paid some money to write about video games for many years before that. So,
excellent. Thank you all. We're going to start just by talking a little bit about the investment process. It's a little bit different for each of you. So I'd like to start with John. Can you talk a little bit about how preparing a pitch for publishers might be different from pitching to investors?
Sure. So I think there's a real key difference. If you're working with a publisher is looking to fund your game. They're not looking to fund your studio per se. So it's really about making a business case for how the game that you are pitching can be profitable, can be commercial. They're less interested in what you do after that. There's usually things around, like first right of refusal for sequels, that kind of thing. But they're broadly, publishers are not looking to take an equity stake in your studio. They are looking to give you a development advance to help you finish the game and then basically recoup on that. Whereas for investment, for what Chris is doing, it's really about looking at the company, like what's the bigger picture? It's something that is longer than a single game deal. It's equity, and there's going to be an exit strategy. I'll let Chris talk about that. But yeah, for publishing, it's really about that game that you are pitching. Can that be successful? Can it be funded? If it can't make money, it won't get funded, really.
And Chris, what sort of things do you look for in a pitch that might not appear in, say, a publisher deck?
Yeah, so the main thing we're looking for is the team. So our criteria of sort of, have you shipped a game before? Have you been through the pain of getting something into market, finding an audience? It doesn't have to have been a wildly successful game, but just having gone through the journey. And then we focus on sort of what's the strategy for the studio. What sort of studio are you trying to build? What sort of games are you trying to build? What's the plan over time? You know, if you just literally, it's a small team trying to build, they just want to do one game, then we would tend to say to them, go and look for grant funding and a publisher, and that's the right route for you. When you're more thinking about, we want to build a long-term organization that builds games or builds technology platforms for games, that's when a fund like ours would get involved. But, you know, we're still looking for those criteria around, ultimately still looking at, is what you're going to build going to be successful? But the way we get confidence around that is, does the team have the capability? Do they have a credible plan? Can they get the right funding for what they're trying to build, including our funding? Do we have a belief that that will then be targeting a market that's big enough that can generate a return for our investors?
And I think it's something we're all talking about right now. It's this idea that the industry is going through a time of change. You know, we're in a recession. We talk a lot about how investors and publishers are more risk averse than they've been in the past. What do you think, and this is for both John and Chris, you know, what can developers do to make their investment pitch more attractive?
I think testing your audience early is probably the biggest thing. Prove that there is both sizable demand niche, so you're not trying to boil the whole ocean, you're trying to go after something that you can find a path to. So have you got a channel to that market? Do you have influencer relationships? Do you understand the social media dynamics around the audience that you're trying to target? Have you started to test with that audience, got feedback around whether they're interested in what you're looking to do? That gives a huge amount of confidence in, yeah, there's something here, and the team understands how to get something to market. Half the challenge is building the game, half the challenge is selling the game.
And I think a lot of that is the same for publishers. It used to be years ago, you didn't need to have a Steam page. I would encourage you not to have one. I would encourage you not to do social media, and then a publisher can go, ta-da, here's the game we signed. But right now, they want to see that there is demand. So everything that Chris has said is true. I've taken games to board level that are not looking for stupid amounts of money and that are very, very commercial, and they got knocked back because they didn't have a Steam page. They didn't have social media. They didn't have enough proof that there was an audience for that game. And the market publishers are so risk averse right now that sort of meant, no, it didn't get signed. And I was like, what? So that awareness, it's like just doing it. And, you know, you have to do your own marketing to begin with. You know, you never used to. And like, yes, you're kind of doing the job that maybe the publisher should be doing. And then they can take credit for it, and that's all cool. But if it gets you signed, that's what it is. It's having that confidence. It's all about confidence. If you are seen as a risk, you are a risk. And it's perceived risk. It's not necessarily a real risk. But the first impression is everything. You can't fix it after that.
Excellent. I think, Tim, this might be a great chance to bring you in. You know, applying for contestable or public funding is a vastly different process. Can you talk a little bit about how a funding application for an organization like Code might be different than a publisher pitch or an investment pitch?
Yeah. So for a start, you only really have one opportunity with a grant funding application. So we don't go back to you serially like you might go back and forth with an investor or a publisher refining things. So we require quite a lot of detail up front, and I think people find that quite surprising sometimes. It takes around 40 hours to fill out an application for Code grant funding, and that's a lot of time and it's a big commitment. But we're looking for all of the information that a publisher or other investor would extract from you over a long period of time. So we're looking for what you might call a brochure version of your game design document if you haven't got a prototype running. We want a lot of detail about the core gameplay loop and reasons to believe in that. But most importantly, we need to see that you are following some kind of marketing process. And that's even if the game is very early on. We need to see evidence that you've thought about who is the audience for this game? How am I going to reach them? And we're also looking for the earliest bits of validation, really, and evidence that you understand that you're going to have to go on quite a journey. Because it's really important when you go to a publisher or very often to an investor like Alt Ventures, you're going to get a larger sum of money, which will probably take you all the way to market, but from code you never will, right? So if you're getting prototype funding, it's $40,000. You're not going to ship a game on 40K. If you're getting startup funding, it's up to $150,000. And again, what we want to see is what would this $150,000 do to take you from point A to point B, where point B means you can go to a publisher and raise the rest of the money to actually ship the game. But you know, we do have a lot in common with publishers and other investors in that we have a relentless commercial focus. We're not looking for games as art. We're looking to see the creation of sustainable game studios in this country.
And when would you say, Tim, is sort of the right time for developers to get involved with code? I know you have lots of different sort of funding options or sort of ways that you group the fund. Should people come to code when they are just starting to form an idea, or should they come more prepared than that?
Really, I think you should come to start talking to us when you are sure you are going to be making a game for a commercial purpose. We have regional content managers and VUs in the audience. In fact, Anthony is over there as well. So you can go introduce yourselves to them and start talking to them about your ideas and your project, and you'll get some really good early indication of whether we think this is a good idea or not such a good idea. And so I would say it's definitely, the sooner you start doing things and talking to us, the better. But that doesn't mean that we would expect an application for funding necessarily very early on. So we would encourage you to wait until you've got your ducks in a row to make that application. We generally say you can only bring the same game back twice. So if you're knocked back the first time, you can come back again. There are some exceptions occasionally, but so you want to give it your best shot, ideally. But yeah, the sooner the better.
And how about for you, John? When should people come to you?
Basically, if you're coming to a publisher, you need to have a demo. Nobody's funding paper ideas anymore. That hasn't happened for years. And have a plan. Have a schedule, have an idea of who your market is, all the things that Chris has talked about having gone out and tested your market. Come prove to me that there's a market for your game, right? I might like it, but prove there's a market. Tell me about your team. It doesn't have to be finished art necessarily with a demo, but it's like something that's representative. It needs to be fun. We need to be able to play it and go, hey, look, there's something here. And if you have, if Code or even if Tim or Chris have invested, that's actually a great sign for us as publishers. If we look at it, if we're not the first investors in the game, there's something there, because neither of these people are signing off on dreams. Neither of them are Oprah. So reach under your seats, everybody.
Thank you, John. And how about for you, Chris?
Yes, I think so. I've done this panel for a couple of years now, and the key thing to always say is come back after you've shipped a game. That's the time to start talking to an investor, because then you've got the credibility that you sort of know what the journey involved is, and then make sure that what you're proposing, so in our case, the studio you're looking to build, you've got a vision around that, but the products you're going to build within it are deliverable for the funding you're looking to get. So the last thing we'd want to do is invest money where it's not enough to get something to market, and then you're forced to go cap in hand and try and raise more money later. So make sure that it's something that is the products that you're looking to build as a studio are well scoped, financeable, you've got a plan, and then you've got this proof point that you can deliver on it because you've done it before. So make sure and I think out in New Zealand there isn't a lot of funding envelope. It's great to have publishing scouts like John that come to New Zealand. We're very remote from the rest of the world. Code do a great job at supporting studios to go and pitch internationally, but most of that money is offshore. From an investment perspective, the market here is too small, so they would prefer, I talk a lot to the offshore VCs and platform investors, they would prefer to see stuff become successful, and then they know they can just swoop in and pick the eyes out of the ones that they want, because there isn't a lot of other money here. So that's why Tencent have had a fruitful time with successful studios here. That's why other, international investors, but they wait until the metrics are sort of proven in market. And then it's a very low risk investment strategy that's really good, high quality people here, make great IP, but, international investors will deploy larger checks when things are already in market and proven.
One thing I want to touch on is you just mentioned that we do this panel every year, and I didn't realize that until just now.
Something like this.
Yeah. One thing I'd love to know is, for all three of you, have you noticed any changes? Every year we sort of cover on the same topics, what goes in a pitch, what's important for each group. Have you noticed any changes between sort of last year and this year as we sort of work our way through this recession time?
I think on the publishing side, there's still a lot of risk aversion from publishers, but money is freeing up. I think this year, the size of deals is getting a bit bigger than it was last year. And I've sort of said, because we talk about this all the time, and I've sort of said that I think Gamescom next year is when we'll be back to not normal, but it will be better again. So things are freeing up there. But again, it's like publishers just want to see more and more. I don't think that's going to change. I think that's the new normal of having to have like, hey, look, you've done your research, you've got data you can bring, you've got a demo, you've built an audience. I think that's the new normal for it.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think the word normal is kind of wrong now because I don't think there is a normal anymore. I think this cycle, when we come out the other side of it, the industry is not going to be the same as it was kind of pre-COVID and into COVID. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I think money is much more sensible than it was back then. And expectations are far more realistic. But there's a number of things that I think have changed. I think that the type of games being funded, it's actually getting slightly narrower now. So publishers seem to be more interested in games with a lot of systemic content and with a lot of replayability. So we're seeing that kind of genre tightening going on. And also, things are still taking quite a long time. So deals tend to be inked over a much longer period of time, which can be really challenging for a studio because once you start negotiating with publishers and trying to raise money, you tend to go into something of a holding pattern. So you're still working, but you're doing a lot of business development work. You're having to react to feedback you're getting from a publisher. You're making changes and adjustments. All the while, you are still burning through your cash and paying all your staff. So when negotiations used to be 3 to 4 months, it was great, 3 to 4 months, and then you're back on the tools working solidly. But when they stretch out to even, like I've heard some deals taking 18 months to ink, it can be really, really stressful on the studio. And I think things will get better, but they're not going to get completely how they were before, definitely.
Yeah, I think, so obviously Tim and John have been in the market a lot longer than I have, but since the fund sort of set up and we started sort of participating in these panels at NZGDC, I'd say there's probably two things. One, the market's way more crowded for product. So the zero interest rate era and the proliferation of acceleration tools and better game engines and the better ease to get things to market meant that the windows are way more crowded. So I think when we started investing, Steam was publishing or was delivering about 10,000 games a year. Now it's about 15,000, so about a 50% growth in games in the window every year. So that means that it's more difficult to be discovered for your game. So that I think has led to some, with the funding tightening up in the market, and the risk aversion means people want to see more proof points and they want to see tighter scoped games that are lower risk with potential breakout success. But then I think looking back at the New Zealand market, the quality, and I'd put this down to the impact Code's had on the market, the quality of studios and projects coming through, the way they're mentored and coached, the way they do have now laser focus on how do we build it, how do we find the audience, how do we fund our way through is really improved. And I think going nationals really helped that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I had a discussion with Simon Sleeve from Xola yesterday after he did his talk on sort of pitching and what have you. And he was saying it's a stark difference between Australia and New Zealand. He was doing the same talk over in Melbourne last week. And he said in Melbourne, he was beating them over the head with it. Whereas in New Zealand, he's like, look, the New Zealand market, New Zealand game developers are much more commercially focused. And that's absolutely helps. It's like I'm sure it helps Chris, but it helps like from a publishing point of view. If I talk to a New Zealand team, I know they've got their ducks in a row because, Tim has beat them over the head until they do. Right?
Yeah. We do have a very commercial focus, but that's, we're tasked with a number of things by our funders. So producing sustainable game development studios is really important, but we also have other kind of metrics that are incredibly important to us and important to the government, which is, for example, increasing the number of underrepresented groups in the industry in positions of management and just as on teams overall, and we've seen huge success in that. In fact, it was really cool at the very beginning of the conference when the survey comes out to see that the number of underrepresented groups in positions of power, if you like, in the industry has gone up markedly, and Code, I think, has played a very important role in that kind of mentoring and bringing on studio managers, and with that comes success. And I think publishers are beginning to realize that tightly scoped products from teams with a diverse experiences are actually really commercially successful in today's market. So yeah, there's a lot of factors in play for us that are really important.
I'm going to sort of change tack slightly. We were talking a lot about, how to make yourself more attractive to publishers and investors. So I'd like to switch to a topic that everyone loves to hate, and that's AI, which can often feel, like astrology for men. One thing that we've talked about or we've seen, and we've obviously reading about it a lot, is, how AI can be used in games. And I think, it's a very controversial topic. It can be a very emotional topic. But I think that one thing that we can sort of easily remove the emotion from is the question of, should developers be using AI imagery in their pitch materials?
No. Really, that's the simple answer. No, I want to, I think there's a whole load of issues around AI with legality and what have you, but the whole thing is I want to see your vision. If you're showing me like some other model's vision of your game, it's like, well, what are you there for? I want to see, can you match what an AI is generating? It's like, I want to see you build that. I want to see you, show me how you're going to do it. All of that. I think people can use it have used it for inspiration for concept art and stuff like that. But in a pitch, I really don't want to see a single piece of AI, honestly.
What about in their games? Should people be talking about using AI in their games?
In terms of AI assets, absolutely not. Again, there's a whole liability issue there. There's a whole legal liability. It would be very difficult, I think, for a publisher to sign a deal, and probably for Chris from an investment point of view, and Tim with Code, to sign something where you don't actually own the content. You're using something that's come from God knows where, and where does the liability end? I understand the appeal for people who are trying to get things up and running quickly. I really do, and I'm not going to say, hey, don't use it for prototypes or concept art or whatever, but like in a shipped game, absolutely not.
Yeah, so sorry, just to add to that, I think that there are going to be some pretty major legal tests, and the kind of winds that we see blowing are, everyone's been very worried. If you are a company that is selling AI generative tools, then you're in the firing line. But in fact, I suspect in America that people who are using AI will also end up in the legal firing line, which is, why I think publishers as well will be quite averse. So, of course, the other thing is, what do you mean by AI? We've been using AI since the day dot in video games. So it's really just this very specific, LLMs and other forms of generative AI that are the things that we're focusing on. Obviously, clever use of AI is absolutely vital for games to succeed and innovation to continue to thrive.
Yeah, and I'd just say, and I'm an investor in a couple of AI businesses here in New Zealand, but they're tools, right? They're productivity tools. So I think using the productivity tools, the some generative AI for ideation? Instead of building a Pinterest board, do you just use a Mid-Journey or a Stable Diffusion to just quickly ideate some art concepts that you can then go, okay, this is what we think would work, and then we can instruct the art team to go and actually now go and build what we want to do, the concept art for the game. That's totally valid. But absolutely, and ultimately the test is, what does your audience want? The audience doesn't. I mean, I think we can look at all sorts of existing data points that say, what are the most successful animated linear production features that come out, and they are the distinct art styles. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, that's not Gen AI. Arcane on Netflix, that's not Gen AI. Blue-Eyed Samurai, that's not Gen AI, right? But these are the ones that blow up. That's what the audience wants to see. It's consuming art in an interactive form that people want to pay for. They're not looking to be fed their own, if you want to be fed your own preconceptions, go onto TikTok, right? But if you want to play an interactive game and pay money for it, you're paying for someone's artistic output, commercial because you're paying for it, but so just know your audience, and the audience doesn't want to be fed their own inner thinking and trends, I guess.
I think that's such a good way of framing it, right? AI, this sort of modern day concept of the way that we're thinking about it currently. At the end of the day, they're just tools, right? And John, you sort of touched on this earlier. I think it's really common for people to want to use AI to set up processes early because it can be very efficient. And last year, Kotaku said 2024 will be the return of the demo, right? And so there's been a lot of discussion, I think, lately about, what does it mean to have a demo versus a vertical slice versus an alpha release? Do you think that these definitions have a meaningful differentiator between them?
For consumers, no, not so much. I mean, for consumers, everybody loves a demo. You get to play a demo. You get to try a game. I think it's about how it's framed to you. Is this an early playtest? Is this something where the developer's looking for feedback, or is this, hey, this is the demo. This is what I'm going to use to persuade you to buy the game. Is this your next fest demo? There's a lot to be said. There's a lot more developers are doing multiple demos now, and they're trying to get data. I've worked in free to play. For my sins. And one of the things that we did get out of that was a lot of data. You get a lot of data about what players are doing, what they're struggling with. Demos can be fantastic for that. I've seen developers do multiple rounds of closed or open betas, and they're extracting lots and lots of data, not in a nefarious way, not in a, they're not getting your social security number and your visa, but in terms of what actions players are doing. So it's to try and refine the game. Are players getting through the tutorial? Are they getting here? How long are players playing a demo for? And I actually think that kind of data is also really useful if you're going to pitch to a publisher or you're going to pitch to an investor. If you've got data of hey, players are really engaged. We did this demo. Our average play time was 40 minutes and it's a small demo or whatever it is. So I think there's a whole lot of uses for demos rather than just sales. Next Fest is obviously the pinnacle of that. You look at the games on Next Fest and add them to your wish list. Please add them to your wish list and, work out what you're going to buy in the future. But there's so many more uses for them.
Excellent. Let's say, for instance, that we've got a great idea. We've made some demos. We've got some incredible data. We're ready to go pitch to publishers. Maybe we're lucky enough to have a launch date. How important is it for a developer to plan beyond that date? So we have a great idea. How much more information does a publisher need? Do we need to think about things like DLC, for instance?
I think you've got to look beyond launch. One of the things that Simon talked about in his talk yesterday was that your final milestone is not release, because find me the time, when did you last have a game that didn't have a post-release bug fix, right? So you've got to have that. I think planning for DLC, having an idea of DLC is always great. Not every game is going to be successful enough to get it. The case when we were working on Dredge at Team 17 with Black Salt Games, we all knew the game was going to be huge. Black Salt Games were very cautious, and they were like, let's wait for some sales figures and then we'll talk about DLC. Whereas everybody at the top of Team 17 was going, give us some DLC. When can we start on that? We know it's going to sell. And of course we did do DLC, and it took longer than I think Team 17 wanted, but I kind of get where they were coming from. I think I see a lot of times when games are pitching oh, we're going to do this DLC and this DLC and this DLC. And it's like, yeah, cool. Let's see how you go. You might not get there. I actually think one of the things that I'm talking to developers about more now is, yes, you need to plan beyond release, but I'm actually more interested, if you're going to be very commercial, what are you going to provide for a pre-order bonus? You know, you see that more and more with games where, oh, if you pre-order, you know, you get a skin or a soundtrack or something else. That's a really, really useful tool for publishers in maintaining full price, because you're either discounting for pre-orders or at launch, or you're adding some value and maintaining that price. And the more that you can sell at full price at launch, happy days. So if you go in with that kind of mindset, publishers are going to be very, very keen, because they're like, oh, hang on a minute, you know the market, you know, you're looking at this in a very, very commercial way. And so I think that's, you know, DLC, great, but like, think about what you're going to do with your launch, even if, you're just pitching.
And for you, Tim, when we spoke a little bit earlier about, in terms of preparing for your pitch, a lot of it is sort of marketing data and marketing content. How important is it for publisher or for developers to plan to self-publish? Obviously, we're talking about pitching to publishers and pitching to investors, but that might not happen. How important is it to plan for Plan B?
It's absolutely vital. And in fact, probably the single biggest thing that I think I have learned in the last 2 years working with studios in this quite difficult period has been, it doesn't matter how good your proposition is. So let's say you've done all your homework, you've shown that there's an audience, you've got a really, really good demo, you've got lots of publisher interest, but there are so many reasons why you might not land a deal, or you might land a deal at the wrong moment. So it kind of puts all your plans out of kilter. So in fact, I think from Code's perspective, our advice now is very, very clear to all developers that we work with. Start from Plan B. So it may still remain your Plan B. It may not be your ideal scenario, but you must have a plan for what happens if we get no further funding. How are we going to cope with this? How are we going to survive? What are we going to do? Now, the key thing about your Plan B is that you're going out quite early to talk to consumers for very good reasons. So you want to collect as much data as you can about, whether they enjoy the game, what they like, to inform your development. But you also want to start building your seed audience and building those points of validation, because it takes so long to get to even a very small critical mass. So people always, their eyes go out like this when I say, it will take you, if you start from zero and you've never made a game before, it'll take you 2 years to get to 500 followers on social media generally, right? You've got to find ways to accelerate that. But starting from the position that you have to build your audience in order to be attractive to a publisher to sign. It's no longer the case you build an amazing game that's an amazing proposition for a publisher to publish, and they will go out and find your audience. Because if 2 games that are equally good, equally compelling, come to that publisher or that investor, and one of them has a small seed audience which is very active and excited, and the other one has nothing, the publisher will always sign the game that has the seed audience, always. Plan B is the plan you start with, and you try and interweave it with your plan A. And in fact, your plan B, you may actually find that once you've built your seed audience and you've started to get that traction, that plan A ceases to be quite as attractive as it was before. Giving 50% of your revenue or whatever it is to a publisher, if you are delivering them everything signed, sealed and delivered, it gives you some confidence both in the negotiation, if you do negotiate, or to perhaps do it on your own if you've got a particularly good way of reaching the market.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, from our perspective, Plan A is the self-publish route. So we've had, of the 13 studios we invested in, so 2 got publishing deals. 1 was after it went into early access, so the game already released, and Abiotic Factor was ready to go into early access when it went into publisher negotiations. So the game could have released on a self-published basis, but it made more sense to delay the launch, polish the content, add more content, and then bring it out with publisher support. And then the other thing is you just don't know what the journey with the publishers might be. So we had a couple of games that had partnership deals signed with very big global partners at the time we invested. And then there was restructuring in the industry and teams got fired and strategies got changed and those partnerships ended before the games got released. So there's a lot of things you don't control. The things you can control are the game you're building and your market that you can reach out and touch yourself. So it's the most, my experience in the small sample set from the funders, it's the most uncomfortable thing for the teams is to go and showcase their product early, particularly shouting into an empty room or shouting into the wind when people aren't listening. But all of those exercises are hugely valuable. Even if there is no audience and you're pushing social media content out, once the audience builds, recycle it. None of this is wasted effort. So, start early on that and you get better and better and better at it. And Deepfield are a classic case of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So to give you an example, Deepfield knew they needed to build a connection to the audience and they really wanted to test their ideas and also test the kind of world setting, whether people found that kind of the whole shtick of kind of Half-Life and SCP working. So they started doing a series of what they call water cooler conversation videos between Abe and Janet. And these videos were released and it was literally into a completely empty room. No one was looking at them. No one was picking up on it. And very slowly, they were being made for TikTok, but they kind of started to pick up a little bit on YouTube. But you know what? The huge payback came when they did start getting traction from their Steam test period. So we were doing big Steam tests and lots of people were coming in to play the game. People started looking for abiotic factor content. And they had a massive content library of all these videos that no one had watched. And so this work is, if you're going to be successful, this work will never be wasted. And it's one of the things I say, it will break your heart producing all this content that no one looks at, but you have to do it. You have to keep believing in the stuff that you're laying down, because the more successful you get, the more this content will be useful and relevant and repurposable in the future. It was a really good lesson to learn, really, from Abiotic Factor.
Beautiful. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I'd like to go ahead and open the floor for questions. I'm not sure, we're going to pass a microphone around, it looks like. Are there any questions?
Cool. We'll start with, did you have a hand? Someone here. Oh, yeah. Cool. Here you go.
Hi. A question for anyone, really. Can you speak about free-to-play and live service games and how that changes what a publisher might be looking for in terms of pitching or approaching you guys?
I think a free-to-play game, there's a small subset of publishers who are going to be looking for free-to-play games. I think if you're talking free-to-play, the chances are you talking about mobile?
Virtual reality.
Virtual reality. Okay, so we're getting even narrower, unfortunately. Wow. Look, I think free-to-play for something for VR is going to be a tough sell. I think at the moment there's a lot of appetite for VR from consumers, but nobody's really buying the games as far as I can see. And publishers have been a little bit reticent to get involved with VR because they've been burnt. So that it's kind of difficult. You mentioned free to play, and you also said games as a service, like live service games.
That's right.
Yeah. So I've worked on free to play live service game on mobile and web, and it's brutal. I ran a company in Australia, Kixeye, and we had you would be happy with the revenue, trust me, but the investors were not. It was considered not a success. And if you look at the market at the moment, there are a lot of games, that are in that kind of live service space. So this year, Concord on console came out and then didn't very quickly. And there was also the Suicide Squad Justice League game that is, to some extent a live service game, and that has not succeeded. The investment that's involved and required to really establish a live service game is huge, because live service games, online multiplayer games, can only thrive when there's a player base. And if there isn't a lot of concurrence, if you go and look on Steam, the amount of games, you look at the concurrent players, and it can just be heartbreaking. So I think it's a super, super tough place to be at the moment, especially with so much risk aversion on the publishing side. I'm sorry, I don't have a nicer message for you.
Avoid it like a plague. Avoid it like the plague.
Sure, yeah. I would. I'm not having anything to do with it, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's just maths. So free-to-play games need huge audiences to convert a very small number of players to spend money to make the revenue large. And then you end up in this huge, you have to invest a lot in player acquisition, user acquisition, to get that small percentage to give you enough revenue to then spin a flywheel. So there are still some mobile publishers, there's not many of them left, that do look for those sorts of things, but they would go after very small budget mobile games that can be quickly prototyped and quickly thrown into the market. And if the flywheel spins, then you feed the money in. So we're talking budgets for the games of like 100K, and then all the investment goes into user acquisition if you get this flywheel of LTV greater than CAC by a factor of 3, and then you pump it. VR, I absolutely echo John. The platforms want the content, so your better conversations are not to go, let's go free to play to the customers. It's let's talk to build really cool content for the platforms, get them to fund it, because they're the ones that actually want the content at this point of the user adoption cycle. They're your most likely revenue stream. And then if they want to give it away free to their player base using Quest or using PSVR 2 or whatever, have that conversation with them as the publisher platform partner, because they'll have the best understanding of how their audience wants to interact with their hardware and the content that comes out on it.
More questions over here? Yep. Hi. So assuming that someone has, a studio has done all their homework and has a solid pitch and everything, what's the sort of biggest red flag that you tend to see in each of your fields?
We're squirming now.
Yeah. Look, I think sometimes when the red flags for me would be over-optimism on sales. Quite often I see pitch decks where like developers are like, oh, my game is going to be $60. No, it's not. Or I'm going to, here's our low plan. We think 1 million is achievable, like 1 million units. And it's like, well, that's nice. So that sometimes over-optimism there, and just a lack of research in terms of the market, of seeing where you sit in it. Like if you don't have the awareness of where your game could sit in the market, that's a big red flag, because you don't have your commercial hat on. The same way as when people come to me and say, oh, look, we think we've got this game and it's going to be $5. And it's like, nobody's making money on $5 games. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but publishers are not really going to be in the business of, taking a game to sell at $5, because how do you discount from there? So, I mean, those would be the major things up front for me, I guess.
I think from our perspective, it's fine to compare your gameplay in a general sense with massive AAA games, just to say it's this kind of game. But when you are benchmarking a game that you bring to code, please don't benchmark against Zelda or,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you're not the new Minecraft.
Exactly. We want you to find other indie games in this kind of niche and look at the kind of figures that they're doing and differentiate yourself from peers rather than kind of moonshots. I think that's key. The other thing is, from our point of view, a massive red flag is a team that comes with one person and says, I'm going to hire an art director, an animator, and they can't name anybody. That's a massive, massive red flag for us. We need to know the team that you are working with, right? Even if they're not presently working with you, we need them identified. We want to know who these people are. We need to believe that you can make the game that you're bringing to us.
Yeah, I'd say for us it's the team. So if you haven't, and it's really, really interesting, right? The conversations you have with people on their first game, where it is, the world's the oyster and this is what we're trying to build and we've seen the success of these other games and, we can replicate this, or we might have got some, we might have pushed a concept out there and look how people have engaged around it and that. And then you talk to people who've shipped games before and they're like, it's just a reality check, right? Oh, yeah, so we've done this before. If this is successful, it might do this. And it's like the calibration after you've shipped your first game is immense. So that, for us, that's the red flag. If you haven't shipped before, it's like, please go and ship a game and then come back and have a conversation with us.
Thank you so much. I'll just go to you next, and then got you too.
Cool. Oh, thank you, Josh. Hey, so it's great that we have a perspective from the different perspectives, like from investment firm, publisher, and government agency. But something I've always been wondering about is what about platforms like Sony or Xbox or Meta? Like, what might they be looking for instead compared to you guys? And then kind of the follow-up question that relates is like, what might they be looking for instead? Like the investment firm might be looking for equity, and then maybe for publishers there's like some sort of revenue share. Like, what's kind of the difference? And can they work together? Like maybe you can get money from a platform and then also a publisher. Like does that work, or is there a conflict of interest basically?
So platform holders will look for games. It's harder. They tend to be looking for larger things. They tend not to be taking on indie titles. It has happened. For a platform holder to be into that, for a start, they'll probably be looking for exclusivity. But they'll be looking for like, what is your game bringing to our platform? How is it using our platform? So if you're talking to Sony, you're going to talk about how you're going to use the DualSense controller and how you're going to use the haptics and the feedback and all of that. If you're not, why are you talking to Sony? They want to know why why you are good for their platform. So whichever platform it is, you need to basically make the case for, hey, we are good for your platform. It's a bit of a moonshot, to be honest. Nintendo used to do a bit of funding around indies, and they really have wound that back. They're not doing it so much. Again, PlayStation used to have a fund where they could give indies money to sort of make games in markets that weren't really being tackled on the platform. They wouldn't market them for you, but they would give you some money. So I worked on a game that Sony had part funded that way, Yonder the Cloudcatcher Chronicles. And that was great, but we got no marketing support and they still recouped. Can that exist along with a publisher? Yes, absolutely it can. So in that situation, so with Yonder in particular, we did end up taking it to other platforms when the exclusivity expired, but I also took it to a publisher for retail. And then I took it to a publisher in Korea and we published it locally there. And I also took it to Japan and published it there. So absolutely that can happen. In terms of how that works, always if a platform holder is funding you, they're going to want to recoup that. How that works is going to vary. Publishers are going to want to recoup their investment. So it can happen. It gets a little bit more complicated the more people you've got involved. Is the main thing. But yeah, absolutely it can.
Yeah, and there are some programs in some of the platforms around providing small amounts of support for like porting and for underrepresented groups and studios. It's a complete black box. It's very hard to know how to access. I mean, you can put applications in through the developer portals once you've got the dev kits and you're sort of building a version for that console platform, but the certainty or even visibility over how to get it and when you get it and why you got it, it's just non-existent. The other thing you've just got to be aware, so they can show a lot of interest in games that are getting good traction or have got good social media traction, but the thing you can't predict is whether that interest ever converts into anything, because the other thing you don't have visibility on until they do their showcase reels is what else they're working on. So the consoles are very, very secretive about some of the projects that are being built in the background, and then suddenly an Astrobots comes out, right? Out of the blue, almost. So that they're always working on a lot of things that, even if they show some initial interest, you don't know that in 6-12 months' time, suddenly something else they're working on just steals the thunder. They need to prioritize what they're going to magnify on the platform at any particular point in time. So you've got to fit the slate.
I think as well, there's obviously been great history with Xbox Game Pass and PlayStation Plus funding a lot of indie games. the way that works is changing quite a lot. I know Xbox Game Pass in particular, there are games they've provided funds to indie games, and some of them still haven't shipped. I'm not going to name them now, but there are a bunch of quite high-profile games that are like, oh, we've got Game Pass funding, and they still haven't shipped, and we're talking like 2 years later. So I think they're getting more and more nervous about that. So it's more that when, particularly if you're with a publisher, don't have to be, but particularly if you're a publisher, there are going to be opportunities for Game Pass or PlayStation Plus, whether it's at launch or whether it's after launch. But I think that's maybe too late for what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that point, in the good old days, you used to be able to sign a deal for a subscription platform and get the majority of the money up front and use it to complete a product. Now you're more likely to get a very small signing sum of money, and then Game Pass will give you the larger portion of the money the day you give them the master, and it goes onto the platform. So it becomes a really lovely to have because it gives you that security at that moment, but it doesn't, unless you can borrow against that from a bank, which again, in this environment is going to be a pretty big ask. It's not actually going to help you complete the game financially. So it's an important thing to bear in mind.
And that would be a revenue advance as well, wouldn't it? So the money you get at the launch point means you're not getting revenue after launch until that advance has been effectively repaid.
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. So thank you all very much. Let's give the Tim and John and Chris a round of applause, please.